that the barrage of bombardment has stopped. However, as I said, as of earlier this week, there was over 350 Palestinians killed through violence and by Israeli defense forces in Gaza just since the ceasefire. So the killing hasn't stopped, but at the scale, the nightly trauma of bombardment, again, appreciate that. It's hard to imagine for anyone, ordinary Palestinians, and as I work with our Israeli and Palestinian human rights partners, to imagine the trauma of it breaking down. So what we really need with the utmost urgency is for that to hold and the ceasefire not to break down. And the US government.
You heard the voice, and now you know the truth that makes the comfortable uncomfortable and turns the complacent into the complicit. Because what you just witnessed was not merely one humanitarian official describing a humanitarian crisis, but rather an indictment of the entire moral architecture of our so-called international order. And if you think this is just about statistics, just about numbers and aid trucks and bureaucratic protocols, then you have missed the catastrophic moral earthquake that is shaking the foundations of everything we claim to believe about human rights and international law. Because this Oxfam chief just told you in language stripped of diplomatic niceties that the United States government is enabling Israel to commit what multiple international bodies and human rights organizations are now calling a genocide, and the killing hasn't stopped. It has merely changed its registration in our collective consciousness from spectacular bombardment to systematic suffocation, from the visceral horror of nightly explosions to the slow-motion extermination through calculated deprivation. 350 Palestinians have been killed since the ceasefire was announced, and that figure rises to 373 when updated. And this is what they dare to call a ceasefire, this grotesque theater of peace where the cameras turn away while the methodical erasure of a people continues under bureaucratic obstruction rather than aerial bombardment. And you need to understand something profound happening here, because Amnesty International has declared that Israeli authorities are still committing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza by continuing to deliberately inflict conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction, which means this is not hyperbole, not activist rhetoric, not emotional overreaction, but the considered judgment of the world's premier human rights organization, using the most legally precise terminology available under international law. The chokehold is the point, the suffocation is the strategy, the starvation is the weapon, and what we are witnessing is nothing less than the deliberate weaponization of humanitarian aid itself, because Netanyahu ceased the entry of aid to Gaza after Hamas refused to accept a U.S. proposal. By March 2nd, Israel blocked all humanitarian aid from entering Gaza in violation of the ceasefire agreement, demonstrating with crystalline clarity that the aid blockade is not an unfortunate byproduct of military necessity, but rather an intentional instrument of collective punishment and potential genocide. And when you hear that an RWA has been blocked by Israel from directly bringing in any humanitarian assistance, including food, for 8 to 9 months, since March 20th, 2025, you begin to comprehend the systematic nature of this atrocity, the bureaucratic precision with which an entire population is being starved into submission or extinction. The numbers tell a story that should make every American's blood run cold, because, according to the World Food Program, only half the required food aid is currently reaching Gaza, while a coalition of Palestinian relief agencies says total aid deliveries amount to just 1/4 of what was agreed under the ceasefire, and Israel has blocked essential and nutritious food items, including meat, dairy and vegetables crucial for a balanced diet, instead allowing non-nutritious foodstuffs like snacks, chocolate, crisps, and soft drinks, which reveals the sadistic precision of this campaign, the calculated choice to allow substances that prolong suffering while denying those that sustain life. But here is where the moral depravity reaches its zenith, where American complicity transforms from passive negligence to active facilitation of genocide, because the Biden administration gave Israel a 30-day ultimatum demanding a minimum of 350 aid trucks to enter Gaza daily, and when that deadline expired, and Israel not only failed to meet the U.S. criteria, but concurrently took actions that dramatically worsened the situation on the ground, particularly in northern Gaza, when by the end of October an average of just 71 trucks a day were entering Gaza, when every humanitarian metric showed Israel was flagrantly violating both international law and American conditions, the Biden administration decided there will be no reduction in U.S. arms assistance to Israel despite the situation being a very dire circumstance. And this is what systemic genocide looks like in the 21st century. This is how liberal democracies facilitate mass atrocity while maintaining the aesthetic of humanitarian concern, through strongly worded letters followed by absolute capitulation, through deadlines without consequences, through the theater of accountability that serves only to demonstrate the worthlessness of American moral authority. USAID concluded the looming famine in Gaza was the result of Israel's arbitrary denial, restriction, and impediments of U.S. humanitarian assistance, and if Blinken determined the Israelis were arbitrarily restricting aid, then the government would be required by law to halt military assistance. But Blinken submitted the agency's official position, siding with Ambassador Lowe, which meant that military support would continue, overruling his own experts, his own aid agency, his own legal framework to ensure the weapons kept flowing to a government actively committing what his own people called genocide. The technical violations become overwhelming in their systematic horror because, as the U.S. demand, Israeli forces accelerated their efforts to bombard, depopulate, deprive, and erase the Palestinian population of the North Gaza Governorate, and Palestinians remain held within less than half the territory of Gaza, in areas least capable of supporting life with humanitarian aid still severely restricted, and Israel deliberately continues not to provide or allow necessary supplies to reach the civilian population, creating conditions that could lead to the destruction of Palestinians in Gaza, particularly considering the enhanced vulnerability of the population to sickness and spread of disease following months of famine. And this is the legal definition of genocide, not the popular understanding of genocide as solely mass killing, but the deliberate infliction of conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of a group, and every single element is present here, documented, verified, undeniable. Amnesty International concluded in December 2024 that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, carrying out 3 acts prohibited under the Genocide Convention with specific intent to destroy Palestinians in Gaza, including killings, causing serious bodily or mental harm, and deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction. And this was not a preliminary assessment, not a provisional finding, but a comprehensive legal determination by an organization that does not use such terminology lightly. The ceasefire itself has become a grotesque farce, a propaganda achievement that allows the international community to pretend the genocide has paused while Israel violated the ceasefire agreement at least 591 times from October 10 to December 2 through continuation of attacks by air, artillery, and direct shootings, including shooting at civilians 164 times, raiding residential areas 25 times, bombing and shelling Gaza 280 times, and demolishing people's properties on 118 occasions. And you need to sit with that number because nearly 600 violations of a ceasefire in less than 2 months reveals that Israel never intended to honor any agreement, that the ceasefire was merely operational cover for a recalibration of genocidal methods from spectacular to systematic, from bombardment to bureaucracy, from missiles to malnutrition. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights stated that Palestinians have been presented the grimmest of choices: die from starvation or risk being killed while trying to access the meager food made available through Israel's militarized humanitarian assistance mechanism, adding that this militarized system endangers lives and violates international standards on aid distribution, and that the willful impediment of access to food and other life-sustaining relief supplies for civilians may constitute a war crime, which is the language of law confronting the reality of organized extermination. The militarization of aid distribution represents perhaps the most dystopian innovation in this campaign of systematic destruction, because the militarized distribution mechanism of food supplies through the newly established Gaza Humanitarian Foundation began on May 27, and since then thousands of Palestinians reportedly walked towards these distribution sites to receive food packages, but several shooting incidents resulted in mass casualties, and according to OACA, as of June 11, the Gaza Ministry of Health reported that hospitals have received 224 people killed and over 1,858 people injured from areas newly designated for food distribution, transforming humanitarian aid from an instrument of survival into a mechanism of slaughter, forcing desperate starving people to walk into killing zones for the chance at sustenance. And if you think this sounds like something from a dystopian novel or a historical atrocity we thought humanity had moved beyond, you are beginning to comprehend the moral catastrophe unfolding before our willfully blind eyes. International aid agencies rejected U.S.-Israeli aid plans, saying they weaponize humanitarian aid, violate principles of neutrality, will exacerbate mass displacement, and would not be able to meet the scale of aid required, because aid professionals understand what politicians refuse to acknowledge, that this system was designed not to feed people, but to control them, not to alleviate suffering, but to choreograph it. the legal architecture should be defending Palestinian civilians, but has instead been systematically dismantled by Israeli intransigence and American protection, because Federal continues to restrict access to critical aid and relief supplies, violating multiple orders from the International Court of Justice for Israel to ensure Palestinians have access to humanitarian supplies in the case brought by South Africa to prevent Israel's genocide, and Israeli authorities have failed to investigate or prosecute those suspected of responsibility for acts of genocide or hold accountable officials who have made genocidal statements, creating an environment of total impunity where the worst crimes imaginable are committed in full view of international institutions that issue rulings without enforcement mechanisms and condemnations without consequences. In flagrant defiance of the ICJ's determination of a plausible risk of genocide in Gaza and the protective measures the court ordered, Israel continued to deliberately deny or obstruct the delivery of humanitarian relief, and this represents not merely a violation of international law, but an assault on the entire premise of the post-World War II legal order, the idea that there are some acts so heinous that the international community will unite to prevent them, and that framework is collapsing in real time because the United States has decided that its strategic alliance with Israel matters more than every principle it claims to uphold. The complicity runs deeper than passive negligence into active facilitation, because even as the genocidal violence became visible, states, mostly Western ones, have provided and continue to provide Israel with military, diplomatic, economic, and ideological support, even as it weaponized famine and humanitarian aid. And at this critical juncture, it is imperative that third states immediately suspend and review all military, diplomatic, and economic relations with Israel, as any such engagement could represent means to aid, assist, or directly participate in unlawful acts, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. But instead we see the German government lifting suspensions on arms export licenses, we see the Biden administration approving additional military aid packages, we see a systematic protection of Israeli impunity at every international forum where accountability might be pursued. The silence and at times material support of Israel's military by powerful nations signals distressing complicity in Gaza's deepening crisis, and whether through the transfer of weapons or diplomatic obstruction of resolutions, such actions have effectively granted Israel impunity, transforming Western democracies from bystanders to co-perpetrators, from witnesses to accomplices in what may be remembered as one of the defining genocides of the 21st century. The humanitarian consequences are documented with the precision that should make denial impossible, because Israel's tightened blockade cut off basic necessities, causing a severe hunger crisis and imminent to confirmed famine as of October 2025, and about 1.111 million people experience catastrophic food insecurity, which is the highest ever recorded number of people in IPC Phase 5 catastrophe, both in terms of percent of population and total number of people, and when you understand that food security experts have never recorded numbers this catastrophic in their entire system of measurement, you begin to comprehend that we are witnessing a deliberate engineering of famine on a scale unprecedented in modern humanitarian practice. The World Food Programme used to serve 1 million meals per day until the end of April, then it was 500,000 a week ago, and now they serve 250,000 meals per day. And that countdown is not an accident of logistics, but a feature of Israeli policy, a deliberate strangulation of the humanitarian response that transforms aid agencies into witnesses to their own obsolescence and the population they serve into victims of calculated extermination. Food is not even 40 kilometers from where people are, but long delays in Israeli approval to collect and move any aid that enters means missions often have to be aborted, demonstrating that proximity is irrelevant when political will to starve a population is absolute. The historical parallel becomes unavoidable, because what we are watching is the systematic application of siege warfare against a civilian population, the deliberate use of starvation as a weapon, the calculated infliction of conditions designed to destroy a people, and every single one of these acts has been declared illegal under the Geneva Conventions, identified as war crimes under the Rome Statute, and recognized as potential acts of genocide under the Genocide Convention. Yet they continue day after day, month after month, while the United States provides diplomatic cover and military hardware, while European nations issue concerned statements followed by resumed arms sales, while the entire apparatus of international humanitarian law reveals itself as a facade that applies to small countries and defeated enemies, but not to American allies with nuclear weapons and powerful lobbying organizations. Oxfam and Human Rights Watch have both concluded that the Israeli government is using starvation of civilians as a weapon of war in Gaza, which is a war crime, and this represents the convergence of the world's most credible human rights organizations, reaching identical conclusions based on independent investigations, creating a body of evidence so overwhelming that denial requires not merely ignorance but willful blindness. The bureaucratic mechanisms of genocide deserve particular attention because they reveal how modern atrocities hide behind administrative processes, how the banality of evil manifests in permit applications and inspection procedures. Israeli authorities have rejected a warehouse full of international aid, including oxygen incubators and Oxfam water and sanitation gear, all stockpiled at Al Arish, just 40 kilometers from the border of 2.3 million desperate Palestinians in Gaza, rejected over weeks and months, through an unpredictable and chaotic regime of approval, scanning, and inspection, ultimately controlled by Israeli authorities, with reasons for rejection not clear, creating a Kafkaesque nightmare where life-saving equipment sits kilometers from people dying for lack of it, where the machinery of deliberate obstruction operates with bureaucratic precision to ensure that aid either never arrives or arrives too late. Despite claims by Israeli authorities that there is no limit on humanitarian aid entering Gaza, most major international NGOs have been unable to deliver a single truck of life-saving supplies since March, and Israeli authorities have rejected requests from dozens of NGOs to bring in life-saving goods, citing that these organizations are not authorized to deliver aid, with over 60 requests denied in July alone under this justification, revealing the systematic nature of the aid blockade, the deliberate construction of bureaucratic barriers designed to have one outcome and one outcome only, the deprivation of an entire population until they die or flee. The moral urgency cannot be overstated because Israel has violated the ceasefire more than 500 times in 2 months, killing at least 356 Palestinians, sending the total death toll in Gaza above 70,000, and scholars have estimated 80% of Palestinians killed are civilians, and a study by OHCHR found that 70% of Palestinians killed in residential buildings or similar housing were women and children, which demolishes any pretense that this is precision targeting of militants rather than systematic slaughter of civilians. And when you combine the direct killing with Israel causing unprecedented destruction in Gaza, making large parts uninhabitable, leveling entire cities and destroying hospitals, religious and cultural landmarks, educational facilities, agricultural land and cemetery, you see the contours of what legal scholars call sociocide, the deliberate destruction not merely of individuals, but of the social infrastructure that makes collective life possible, the erasure of a people's capacity to exist as a society. The American political establishment bears particular responsibility because this genocide is underwritten with American weapons, defended with American vetoes, and enabled by American diplomatic protection. Israel made no visible effort to comply with requirements in the Blinken-Austin letter, demanding daily entry of 350 trucks, with late October averaging only 58 trucks making the crossing, while a UN-affiliated famine review committee said starvation, malnutrition and excess mortality due to malnutrition and disease are rapidly increasing and deadly famine was imminent, yet Senator Bernie Sanders' proposals to block continued arms transfers were soundly defeated by the Senate, demonstrating that both political parties are invested in maintaining support for Israel, regardless of the humanitarian catastrophe that support enables, regardless of the international law that support violates, regardless of the genocide that support facilitates. The rot is bipartisan, the complicity is structural, and the moral collapse is comprehensive, extending from the executive branch that refuses to enforce its own laws, to the legislative branch that votes down even symbolic restrictions on arms transfers, to the judicial system that has been notably silent, while American weapons facilitate potential genocide. The systematic nature deserves emphasis because this is not the chaos of war, but the precision of policy, because Oxfam states they are witnessing a campaign of ethnic cleansing, unable to provide any support to remaining civilians in North Gaza Governorate, where people are dying every day. Since October 1, no food has been allowed into northern Gaza, and civilians are being starved and bombed in their homes and tents, creating conditions where a committee of global food security experts warned of a strong likelihood that famine is imminent in areas of northern Gaza, stating immediate action within days, not weeks, is required from all actors directly taking part in the conflict or having influence on its conduct to avert and alleviate this catastrophic situation. And those days and weeks have passed while the international community issues reports and convenes meetings, and the people of northern Gaza continue to starve under a blockade that violates every principle of international humanitarian law. The experts have warned, the data has been collected, the legal determinations have been made, and still the starvation continues because political will to stop it does not exist among those with power to do so. The International Court of Justice orders are being systematically ignored, creating a precedent that could unravel the entire post-war legal order, because if a state can simply disregard binding provisional measures issued by the world's highest court in a genocide case, if it can continue the very acts the court identified as potentially genocidal while facing no meaningful consequences, then what remains of international law except rhetoric for weak states and silence for strong ones? Israel continues to restrict access to critical aid and relief supplies, including medical supplies and equipment necessary to repair life-sustaining infrastructure, violating multiple orders from the International Court of Justice for Israel to ensure that Palestinians have access to humanitarian supplies, demonstrating contempt not merely for Palestinian lives, but for the entire framework of international adjudication. There is no indication Israel is taking serious measures to reverse the deadly impact of its crimes, and no evidence that its intent has changed, as Israeli authorities are continuing their ruthless policies restricting access to vital humanitarian aid and essential services and deliberately imposing conditions calculated to physically destroy Palestinians in Gaza. And this continuation of genocidal policies, despite international legal determinations, reveals something profound about power in the international system, that law functions only when backed by political will. An American protection of Israel has created a zone of absolute impunity where the worst crimes imaginable proceed unimpeded. The testimonies of humanitarian workers on the ground should haunt every person who claims to care about human rights, because these are not activists or politicians, but professionals who have witnessed humanitarian crises around the world. Oxfam stated Israel's relentless air and land bombardment and deliberate obstruction of the humanitarian response is making it virtually impossible for aid agencies to reach trapped, starved civilians in Gaza, with a lethal combination of closed border crossings, ongoing airstrikes, reduced logistical capacity due to evacuation notices, and a failing Israeli permission process that debilitates humanitarian movement within Gaza, creating an impossible environment for aid agencies to operate effectively. And when you understand that Oxfam has operated in conflict zones globally for decades, that they understand how to work under difficult conditions, their conclusion that Israel has made humanitarian response virtually impossible carries immense weight because it indicates a level of systematic obstruction unprecedented in modern humanitarian practice. Israeli authorities are not only failing to facilitate the international aid effort, but are actively hindering it, and Oxfam believes Israel is failing to take all measures within its power to prevent genocide, which is the language of legal obligation, meeting the reality of genocidal conduct. The demographic catastrophe is unfolding with mathematical precision because over 70,525 Palestinians and 2,109 Israelis have been killed as of November 19, 2025, revealing the asymmetry of violence that belies any notion of equivalent suffering. And when more than 300 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli fire and nearly 900 injured since the ceasefire agreement went into effect on October 10, you understand that the ceasefire has not ended the killing, but merely changed its character, made it less visible, less spectacular, more bureaucratic and systematic but no less lethal. Since the ceasefire began, at least 373 people have been killed and 970 injured, while civil defense teams have recovered 624 bodies from destroyed neighborhood, creating a reality where the dead are being excavated from rubble, even as new dead are being created by continuing violence, where the work of accounting for the massacred proceeds simultaneously with ongoing massacre. The ceasefire risks creating a dangerous illusion that life in Gaza is returning to normal, but while Israeli authorities and forces have reduced the scale of their attacks and allowed limited amounts of humanitarian aid into Gaza, the world must not be fooled, as Israel's genocide is not over, and this warning from Amnesty International's Secretary General should be emblazoned across every news broadcast, should be the starting point for every political discussion, should shatter the comfortable fiction that the emergency has passed and normalcy is being restored. What we are witnessing is not merely a humanitarian crisis, but a test of the entire international order, a revealing moment where we discover whether the rules-based international system is anything more than rhetoric deployed against America's enemies and suspended for America's allies, and the answer is devastating, because it's not taking on Israel that has precipitated a crisis for international law, but the fact of brazen violations of international law by a powerful state underwritten by the most powerful state in the international system, namely the United States, that has created the crisis. The consequence, and this crisis will have consequences extending far beyond Gaza, because Israel's continued impunity sends a dangerous message suggesting that parties to other conflicts around the world need not comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, creating a precedent where powerful states backed by powerful patrons can commit atrocities with impunity, while weaker states and non-state actors face prosecution, where international law becomes not a universal standard, but a weapon of the powerful against the powerless. The hypocrisy is transparent, the double standards are flagrant, and the global South is watching as Western nations that lecture the world about democracy and human rights demonstrate through their actions that those principles apply selectively, that Palestinian lives matter less than Ukrainian lives, that Israeli war crimes receive diplomatic cover, while Russian war crimes trigger coordinated sanctions and weapons cutoffs and universal condemnation. The long-term consequences for international humanitarian law and human rights cannot be overstated, because what is being established here is that genocide is acceptable if committed by a sufficiently powerful state with adequate patron protection, that systematic starvation of civilians is tolerable if the perpetrator can claim self-defense, that the deliberate obstruction of humanitarian aid is something the international community will observe and document but never meaningfully punish, and Western democracies are violating their most fundamental commitments to international law and human rights, and the rest of the world is watching them do so in real time, and the full consequences of this collective failure to condemn or halt Israeli violence will be felt for decades to come. Because you cannot spend decades building an international legal architecture premised on universal human rights and the prevention of mass atrocities, then suspend that entire framework when it inconveniences a strategic ally, and expect the rest of the world to take your moral proclamations seriously. The damage to American credibility is irreparable, the erosion of international legal norms is profound, and the message to future perpetrators of mass atrocities is clear. Align with American interests, and you can commit genocide with impunity. Oppose American interests, and you will face the full weight of international condemnation and potential prosecution. And this is not a rules-based international order, but a power-based international hierarchy, where might makes right and law is merely rhetoric. The question that confronts every person watching this unfold is, what are we willing to do about it? Because documentation without action is complicity, knowledge without resistance is consent, and the machinery of genocide depends not merely on those who pull triggers and sign deportation orders, but on those who watch it happen and do nothing, who know the truth and remain silent, who see the evidence and look away. The movement for Palestinian rights has been systematically suppressed, censored, defunded, and demonized precisely because it threatens to expose the moral bankruptcy at the heart of American foreign policy, and that suppression itself reveals how threatening truth is to power, how dangerous accountability is to impunity, how necessary silence is to genocide. We must demand an immediate and permanent ceasefire. We must call for cutting all military aid and arms sales to Israel. We must support the International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice in their efforts to hold perpetrators accountable. We must amplify Palestinian voices that have been systematically marginalized and silenced. And we must recognize that this is not merely about one conflict in one region, but about whether we will allow the entire framework of international humanitarian law to collapse under the weight of American imperialism and Israeli impunity. The stakes could not be higher because what dies in Gaza is not merely the lives of Palestinians, but the very possibility of a world governed by law rather than force, by justice rather than power, by human rights rather than strategic calculation, and we will all live in the ruins of what is being destroyed there, in a world where genocide is acceptable if you have the right allies, where starvation is a legitimate weapon of war if you can claim self-defense, where international law is a cruel joke told to those without the power to ignore it.